Ladies and gentlemen, get you to settle down because we're going to start now. Let me introduce myself. My name is Peter Wise-Jackson. I'm president here at the Missouri Botanical Garden, and I'm delighted to welcome all of you to the garden this afternoon. Of course, I am particularly delighted that we welcome Professor Brian J. Huntley, who is our speaker this afternoon. It is a pleasure, too, for us to collaborate with the Garden Conservancy in bringing Brian to St. Louis for this event. And I'm delighted that Brian is accompanied today by his wife, Merle, who is someplace in the audience. But let me tell you something about Professor Huntley. He was born in South Africa, in Durban, in Natal. He spent his working life in Southern Africa, where he has been a renowned international champion, expert on so many in the field of biodiversity conservation. As an internationally respected conservation scientist, he has over 45 years of field research and management experience in many African countries in particular. Some years ago, in South Africa, there was the creation and establishment of the South African National Biodiversity Institute, SANBI, which he led in its formative years, and is very much a product of his vision, his drive, and his determination. SANBI has grown to be a world leader in promoting knowledge and understanding and sustainable use and conservation of the biodiversity of South Africa, one of the biologically richest regions of the world. He provided exemplary leadership for SANBI, and this has resulted in many countries and organizations not only following his lead, but calling on him for guidance and advice. And this is a role he continues to play since his retirement from SANBI just a few years ago. His work has been recognized through numerous honors and awards, including his election as a vice president of the Royal Horticultural Society in the United Kingdom. He is a corresponding member of the Botanical Society of America. He received the Pritzlaff Medal of the Santa Barbara Botanic Garden, the Kew International Medal, the Leroux Award of the Society of Conservation Biology, and many awards in his home country, South Africa. He also received the Centenary Gold Medal in relation to Kirstenbosch Gardens for his contribution to botanical gardens in Africa. I personally have had the pleasure and honor to be able to work closely and to count Brian and Merle as friends for indeed many years, rather too many to mention. It was about 20 years ago that he and I first met, and we worked closely to organize a global Botanic Gardens Congress that Brian hosted at the Kirstenbosch Gardens in 1998, I should say, when a new agenda for the work of Botanic Gardens of the world was put into place under Brian's leadership and guidance. And he and I worked together very closely following that in the development and subsequently the implementation of a global strategy for plant conservation adopted through the United Nations that Brian has been one of the leaders of and guides now almost every country and most botanical institutions worldwide. For us, it is a pleasure to have Brian here talking about the Kirstenbosch Gardens, the most beautiful garden in Africa. Brian has also published a book on the same subject, and I know that you will be pleased to sign copies afterwards, which are available outside for sale. I would ask you to welcome Professor Huntley to St. Louis in the usual way we do here in St. Louis. Thank you for being with us.
Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's a real pleasure to be back in St. Louis and to be back in this stunning garden Missouri Botanical Garden that has played such an important role in African botany. It's a far away, it's a continent a long way away from Missouri, but the role that NBG has played is very significant, and we certainly look forward to the continued engagement with Africa by this garden. I want to personally thank Peter and Pat Raven, our hosts, and Peter and Diane Wise-Jackson, our hosts, for bringing us to Missouri and to the Garden Conservancy for its support of this visit and our visits to various other gardens to talk about Kirstenbosch. I'm going to be talking about the history and the development and dynamics and challenges of an African botanical garden. So one's got to transport one's thinking from where we are here in this highly developed, wealthy, industrialized, and successful country to the African context. And that's quite a big leap to take. But in order to take that leap, I want us to look at three episodes. We look at the history of the development of Kirstenbosch within the context of Southern Africa's history. So there are three episodes. The first episode from about 1771 through to the early 1800s will describe the discovery and description of the flora capensis and the horticultural treasures from South Africa. The second episode, a century later, from 1895 to 1935, looks at the development of the institution, which was seen as a vision of establishing a Kew in the Southern Hemisphere, a Kew in Southern Africa. And then lastly, about Kirstenbosch in the New South Africa. So those are the three sort of components of this talk, which I think I'll plan to be 60 minutes, so be comfortable. Well, just for those of you who need a little geographic orientation, I think you know the capensis, the Cape flora, one of the 6 plant kingdoms down there on the southern tip of Africa. That's what we're going to be talking about. Where did it all begin? Where did the history of South African botany begin? The birthplace was the Kogelberg. You see this bay on the southern coast of South Africa. It was here that in 1597, a Dutch East Indiaman returning from the East Indies put in to collect water, just short of Cape Town. The Kogelberg, is the hottest hotspot of botanical diversity in the world. And I'll give evidence for that claim as we go through. But it was here that a sailor collected a funny dried thing that looked a bit like a thistle and brought it back to Europe. It ended up on the desk of Charles Lecluse, or Clusius, who illustrated it in this woodcut of 1605. You can see the woodcut. He thought it was a thistle, a strange thistle from Africa. It was the first plant that was described in a scientific paper from the African continent south of the Sahara. On the right, you see the same plant, a watercolor by my daughter, who's a botanical artist, and it's a rather nice presentation of Protea nerifolia, the first plant from Africa. Now, when the Dutch settled the Cape in 1652, one of the first things they did was to build a garden. So you will see, oh, sorry, I've done it. I've pushed the wrong button. You will see up on the slopes of Table Mountain, the company garden, which was established in 1652. It's interesting to note that this garden was 70 years plus ahead of John Bartram's first garden in the United States. So there was the establishment of this garden pretty early in the history of Southern Africa's colonial development. Now, in 1672, the same year, as John Jocelyn published New England's Rarities Discovered, which was the first comprehensive book on botanical information from North America. In 1672, Paul Herman passed Cape Town on his way to Sri Lanka, to Ceylon. He collected material which ended up with Linnaeus. And it was Linnaeus's excitement at looking at this material some years later that caused him to say that this land of the Cape of Good Hope in farthest Africa, no botanist ever before had trod. O Lord, how many, how rare, and how wonderful were the plants that presented themselves to Herman's eyes. In a few days, Herman simply and solely discovered more new African plants than all botanists who ever before him had made their appearance in the world. So here, this excited Linnaeus was describing the flora from a small collection from the Cape, and these are some of the botanical treasures. This is the sort of material, these are the species, just the bulbous species, that were appearing in Europe from the first Dutch settlement in the Cape. And of course, many of them were passing through Linnaeus's hands. But my story really begins in 1771, because that was the year that Joseph Banks, traveling with Cook on the circumnavigation of the world, on the Endeavour, called in Cape Town in 1771. It was so impressed with the flora that he saw there that when he got back to the UK, to England rather, he spoke to George III before George III became a little distracted and let things slip in North America. But George III was probably more passionate about plants than he was about politics. So he was distracted by these Cape plants. He was convinced to send a collector to the Cape. And the collector was the gentleman on the right, Francis Masson. At that time, Kew was perhaps the paramount garden in England. Kew had a habit of appointing Scotsmen as gardeners. They regarded Scotsmen as honest and thrifty, unlike the English. And so Masson was appointed. Masson went to the Cape in 1772. He had been preceded just by a few months by Sparman and Thunberg, who had been sent by Linnaeus. So there in 1772, you had three incredibly competent botanists, and in the case of Masson, a horticulturist, a gardener, who set about collecting the flora of the Cape. And this is where the understanding, the knowledge, the documentation of the flora capensis really began. In America in the same year, of course, and I like to just refer back now and again to the state of affairs in the States, 1772 saw William Bartram going through the Carolinas. And just as he published later in the 90s his travels through North and South Carolina, which is a classic, so too did Sparman, Thunberg, and Masson publish their travels. And so we've got documented from that period the outlines of the flora, the ecology, the peoples of the country, which remain real classics and are constantly referred to. There was another contributor to this documentation of knowledge, and that was William Burchell. William Burchell, self-financed, alone, did what Lewis and Clark were doing in North America. Lewis and Clark, of course, paid by Congress to cross America. Burchell, self-financed, covered 7,000 kilometers through southern Africa. He collected a phenomenal 60,000 specimens of plants and animals, the biggest collection ever made by a single scientist in Africa. And that went back to Europe, and that formed part of the documentation of the Cape flora. What he did, and which is significant to this presentation and to Kirstenbosch, is that on the 11th of February 1811, 200 years ago plus, he walked up a ridge which leads to Kirstenbosch. In fact, it's the very path that we would follow on our daily coming and going from Kirstenbosch to the house that we lived in Kirstenbosch for 20 years. And he looked across the scene and he described it as the beauty here displayed to the eye would scarcely be represented by the most skillful pencil. The light on my face is a little sharp. I wonder if it could be dimmed a little. Sorry. However, that describes the beauty of the scene. That became Kirstenbosch. He said after that visit and on that day that it would be a great thing if a botanical garden could be established in that spot. It wasn't to happen for a century. Not all the botanists that went to the Cape were as dedicated as were Thunberg and the others. James Bowie, who was the second botanist sent by Kew to South Africa, wasn't noted for his dedication. Peter McCann, some years later, said, having a want of application and business aptitude, his great pleasure was to spend his time among the free and easy company of bar parlours, recounting apocryphal stories of his Brazilian and Cape travels, largely illustrated with his big snake and wildebeest adventures. So that was the opinion on Bowie. Bowie nevertheless made a contribution. He was the first to collect Streptocarpus. Streptocarpus is a genus with great decorative value. It's been hybridized successfully in Europe, and I'm sure you've got specimens of it in any temperate house in North America. To round up this first episode, the information gathered together was published by the Irishman from Dublin, who became the director of the Botanical Garden Dublin and at the university, and he had come to South Africa at the age of 24 to become the colonial treasurer. He probably was quite a useful colonial treasurer, but the most important thing was that he compiled the first genera of South African plants, which listed well over 7,000 species for South Africa at the time. And asked about the purpose of this endeavor, he said that copies can be sent to resident doctors, clergymen, and scattered about the country to excite their idle minds and cause them to send specimens of plants to the Cape, which they did. And so he engaged with the people around the country to collect and send material to the Cape, and that established a very important type material which is presently at Kirstenbosch in the herbarium. In North America, William Barton, the same young man, went into the Navy, University of Pennsylvania, and he felt strongly about Americans participating in the documentation of the flora. He commented that this sort of engagement with the flora is all too readily surrendered to foreigners. He felt that Americans should engage with the flora, so he set that program going. Where did they collect in South Africa? Where did they collect in the Cape? I'll just give three examples. The mountains, the acid, sandy mountain soils of the Cape, known as the fynbos, extremely rich in Proteaceae, Ericaceae, Restionaceae. On the richer soils, the richer soils of the plains that have largely been turned over into wheatlands, the Renosterbosch, again a vegetation type extremely rich in bulbs. And then to the north, in the arid west, the succulent karoo. So those three major vegetation units are those that comprise the richness of the Cape flora. What did they find? Well, firstly, Masson found this beautiful Erica massoni, one of the splendors of the Ericaceae, of which there are 760 species in the Cape. Strelitzia reginae. It was named after George III's wife, Charlotte of Mecklenburg-Strelitz. Many people think Strelitzia is native to Hawaii or California. they are wrong. It just comes from a small area in South Africa, and I'll return to Strelitzia a little later. But there were others, the dioramas from the mountains, wonderful moreas, iridaceae, many, many species of iridaceae. There's a rather lovely yellow morea. And then, of course, things like Geyseriza and Spiraxis and many, many more. Endemic families, such as the Bruniaceae. This is a Berzelia Stokii. It's a narrow endemic from the mountains, the Kuchelberg Mountains. Of course, you're familiar with the King Protea, which I associate mostly with business class lounges in South African Airways airports. And then, much more interesting, this endemic Orothamnus from the mountains, the Kuchelberg Mountains. It's a protea. It's called the marsh rose. Very rare, very localized. Other endemic ericas. And then the restios. The restios are probably not familiar. You're probably not familiar with restios. I think this is the family of the future for horticulture. It is an extremely robust and showy plant for borders and for backing to plantings. 300 plus species in South Africa, extremely difficult to germinate, but that has been cracked, and I'll come back to that. It looks rather like a bamboo, but it's Restinaceae, not Poaceae. In summary, the Cape flora, just to give you an overview, Linnaeus described 500 plus species, Thunberg added up to 3,100, and Goldblatt, of course, Peter from this institution who has done so much to promote and document the flora of the Cape, he and John Manning, their most recent count just published was 900 plus species for the Capensis part of South Africa. The country as a whole, 20,000 plus species for South Africa, and then indicate the composition in terms of the characteristic families. Now, episode 2, leaping ahead a century more or less to 1895 and the establishment of Kirstenbosch. All gardens, all fine gardens have a history, and I think we need to always reflect on the history because it adds to our understanding of what they are and where they're going, and what we owe to the visionary people that helped create them. The driving force, sort of at a distance, was the notoriously autocratic and difficult director of Kew, Sir William Turner Thistleton Dyer, who in 1995, reflecting on the flora of the Cape, found it was remarkable that it was the only British possession of consequence that didn't have a botanical institution on the lines of Kew. So that was the first record where somebody of significant stature commented on the need for a Kew in South Africa. It was fortunate that his assistant, his scientific assistant at the time was Harold Pearson, an outstanding star of Cambridge, who had traveled to the east before coming back to Kew to work in the herbarium. And he was nominated by Thistleton Dyer to go to the Cape to fill the post of the newly created chair of botany at the University of Cape Town in 1903. So Pearson left Kew to go to the Cape to become professor of botany there, and he was soon struck by the disinterest that South Africans showed in this wonderful flora in terms of cultivating them in their gardens. South Africans were just planting the usual things that they were familiar with from English gardens and from Dutch gardens. Pearson was a taxonomist, a botanist, a full organism botanist as well, and he came to the Cape specifically to study the gymnosperms. He had a passion for the cycads, and so that was the real sort of personal motivation that brought him to the Cape. And it was more than anything Welwitschia mirabilis, this amazing plant from the Namib, here seen almost as a sort of short tree savanna, if you could call it that, in Angola, in southwest Angola. And so he traveled up to Angola in search of Welwitschia, and although he didn't see this one, this is my personal friend that I've been visiting for 40 years. It has not grown older. I have grown older, but it remains this massive Welwitschia, fortunately still secure in the middle of the Angolan Namib. So Pearson came to the Cape. He did his research on the gymnosperms, for which he was elected Fellow of the Royal Society at a young age. And he promoted the idea of an indigenous, a native plant botanical garden for South Africa. He wrote a seminal paper in 1910. He addressed the South African Association for the Advancement of Science, recommending the establishment of a botanical garden. And in that paper, he describes, as well as Peter Wise Jackson or Peter Raven or anyone else could describe, what a botanical garden should really include in its vision and its strategy. And this was a century ago. He had an understanding of the role of botanical gardens which lasts to this day. He found this spot. This is Kirstenbosch as it was in 1913 when it was established, and this is what he developed. Sadly, he died just a few years later. He had picked up malaria in Angola. He was fairly frail, and after a small operation, he caught pneumonia and died. So he was only 3 years in Kirstenbosch, but he set the pattern for Kirstenbosch. Here you see it on its first Golden Jubilee 50 years later, and this is as it is today in spring. If you come to the Kirstenbosch in September, October, August, this is the sort of scene you will see. Interestingly, when the garden was developed, mostly in the early days by Compton, another graduate of Cambridge, who came to the Cape, and in describing how Kirstenbosch developed, because people would frequently ask, who designed the garden? What sort of landscaping principles were followed? And Compton wrote that the idea of landscaping at Kirstenbosch was always rendered futile by the grandeur and diversity of the setting, making any sort of improvement seem foolish. And this is what happened. The landscape was already there. It had the structure, it had the design. All one had to do was to follow the lines of the landscape. So unlike many gardens around the world, it just followed nature. It didn't follow any geometric or other pattern. And these were the builders of Kirstenbosch. Pearson was fortunate in appointing J.W. Matthews up on the top right there, a Kew-trained gardener, horticulturist, who did an enormous amount of research into what species to grow in Kirstenbosch, how to grow them. He published many, many papers of just basic gardening techniques. So anybody wanting to learn about the history of gardening with indigenous South African plants, one needs to go back to his fairly humble reports on his experimentation with South African plants. There was no fancy equipment. It was built by hand, essentially. But it was built around a focal point, which was the bath, the spring that had been built in 1811. So it had this focal point, completely overgrown when Pearson came there. It was cleaned up, and that becomes the focal point around which Pearson planted out his cycad collection, other gymnosperms, podocarpus, Witheringtonias, and others, all, of course, native to South Africa. Matthews built a rockery, super efficient for keeping the soils dry. Kirstenbosch gets 60 inches of rainfall per year, so it's a very wet spot, but he could create a substrate where he could grow magnificent displays of the very rich succulent flora of South Africa. And one needs to remember that South Africa's got 40% of the world's succulent species, something like 4,000 species of succulent come from South Africa. As you can see, the walkways were made with local materials. The design was soft and following the lines of the relief, but it might not have worked that way. This architect's drawing, you see, was prepared in 1914. Soon after getting to Kirstenbosch and establishing it, Pearson had been reading up gardening books and journals and read about gardens in Italy and France and elsewhere, and came upon in England this a big Palladian bridge in one of the English gardens, and thought, well, it would be wonderful to build this massive Palladian bridge in the center of the garden as a memorial for the first chairman of his board of trustees. Fortunately, he couldn't raise the money and wasn't built. It's one of these occasions where good fortune is not being able to get the money. Because had he built that, it's quite possible that after his death, other designers would come along and follow these sort of classical European lines rather than the natural lines of Kirstenbosch. Now, the main episode is the current period, the last few years, last 20 plus years, since 1990, with the establishment of this National Institute, which was firstly the National Botanical Institute, more recently South African National Biodiversity Institute, and it's about South Africa in the new South Africa, Kirstenbosch in the new South Africa. I think you're all familiar with the massive transition in South Africa since 1990, when President de Klerk released all political prisoners, and the transition towards a democratic government with Nelson Mandela as president, and then a whole series of law reforms. Every law that was part of the past was revised. So that gave us an opportunity to bring a new legislation around everything down to botanical gardens and compliance with the Convention on Biological Diversity, and also, of course, access to global international donor funds, such as the Global Environmental Facility, which provides a great resource of funding for work in developing countries. Now, it happened that on the 11th of February, a group of young botanists had convened a meeting in Mozambique, in Maputo, Mozambique, to discuss a new agenda for African botany. It was a little bit of a clandestine meeting because many of the African states that joined up with South Africans at that meeting would not have been permitted to do so, because this is still before we knew that Mandela was going to be released and a new government formed. But it was fortuitous or significant that on that important day, 11th of February 1990, the day that Nelson Mandela was released, we agreed on a program for botany in Southern Africa, and we were delighted to be able to go to the main plaza in Maputo and listen to the live broadcast of the ceremony around Mandela's release. So it was significant, and this, well, it was perhaps good luck and good timing, because we established SABONET, the Southern African Botanical Network, and there you see one of the collecting expeditions up to northern Malawi, and any botanist will see that that was a fine day out in the field to collect that much of material, and a really good flora of Inyika Plateau was one of the products out of SABONET. We have had expeditions to all the southern African countries, including here in Angola, an extremely difficult country that had been through 30 years of war, and we were able to get Angolan students together, camping out in the mountains of Angola, and here in the Congo Basin, collecting and really documenting the flora and biodiversity of these areas that hadn't been visited by scientists for about 40 years. The outcome of this, and this was a collaborative venture with institutions such as Missouri, the checklists now prepared for South Africa, Southern Africa, and through the Mellon Foundation funded Africa Plants Initiative, 50,000 species for Africa south of the Sahara. So from that singular Protea nerifolia that was collected in 1597 to today, it's risen, the checklist has risen from 1 to 50,000 plus. So that's quite a milestone in botanical history. Conservation was recognized as being a significant component of our program, particularly because South Africa has a highly endemic flora. About 65% of the flora is found nowhere else in the world. And of that, across the country, about 13% are endangered with extinction, but in the Cape, it's a full 36% that are under threat. So the Cape flora is extremely rich, but it's also extremely threatened. And one of the success stories in this program of conservation was finding Erica verticillata that had been regarded as extinct for decades, almost a century, was found in Vienna, of all places, in the Botanical Garden of Schönbrunn and the Belvedere, where 2 centuries earlier, specimens of many South African Ericas had been introduced for the gardens of Emperor Franz Joseph. They had been collected in the late 1700s in South Africa and had survived 200 years of the turmoil of Eastern Europe, and still today are growing well there. And this was reintroduced to South Africa, and here you see it being pollinated in its natural habitat, its type locality, by the endemic orange-breasted sunbird. So this full circle of collection, discovery, collection, transport to Europe, and repatriation to South Africa is beautifully illustrated as an example of, the conservation purpose of botanical gardens. And one could add many other cases of a similar nature. Another line of our program is contributing to the Millennium Seed Bank at Kew. Here are some young horticulturists returning from the hills after a good day's collection of material up in the mountain Fynbos, and that has been fed into the conservation program. As far as indigenous plant horticulture goes, I have already mentioned Pearson's dismay at the disinterest of South Africans in their native flora, and he created, through Kirstenbosch and through the work of people like J.W. Matthews and the succession of garden curators and horticulturists at Kirstenbosch, a strong tradition in native plant horticulture, which includes its background the pelargoniums. Here you see Pelargonium peltatum that was first introduced to Europe in 1700. So, it goes back a long way. And this is the pelargonium, one of the progenitors of the very rich hybrid gardening plants that you see across Europe in the flower boxes of Europe. I guess you see them in the US as well. And these all came from the Cape so long ago. Fortunately, we haven't found everything yet, and this is a really stunning James Britannia, recently discovered. It had escaped the notice of botanists for, until very recently. So there's still very exciting stuff to be found there. And Peter Goldblatt's associate, John Manning, recently did a study of the number of new species described every 10 years for the last 300 years. And it shows that curve is still climbing up. We haven't reached the asymptote yet. So there's still new stuff to come out of Africa and from the Cape. And a lot of this information has been documented into gardening guides. So if you're interested in the flora of the Cape or South Africa and want to plant it, to grow it, there are many guides. And a good website to go for is, let me go back. Plants Africa, plants with a Z, not an S. And that has a, you just go onto that website and you can get anything, over 1,000 South African species with the horticultural, ecological, taxonomic background to them, and hints on planting. Inspiration, education, and transformation has been a very important thrust in the last 20 plus years. One of the first things we did was to find a donor for a school bus. So we have a school busing program going out to the township schools and the very desolate and deprived schools of the Cape Flats, for instance. 20,000 school kids are brought into the garden every year. They get access to, their teachers are trained. I'm sure all of this is a similar program to the sort of programs you have for schools here. The teachers get trained to give the school children work related to their school curriculum, and it's a fine program. And we were very fortunate that even before he was elected president, we had Nelson Mandela be the key speaker at our first school gardening project. And it was wonderful sitting on the podium with Nelson Mandela and noting that his speech had not been prepared by a speechwriter. In fact, it was more than that. It was just his own handwritten, longhand notes that he, and my greatest regret is that I didn't ask him after this function if I could just keep his speech, because it was, it was a remarkable bit of history that 2 years before he was elected president, he was there relating how he had had a passion for gardening when he was on Robben Island, growing vegetables and that sort of thing. And I'd love to have been able to keep that as a historic record for Kirstenbosch. But here are some of the school projects out in the Cape Flats, and you can see how good they look in the transformation to the school grounds of these schools, that using native plants which are water-wise to beautify the gardens. Transformation has not only been in terms of schools and education, but also in terms of our staff. Here you see two sort of groups of curators, garden managers from 1979 and 2012, and you can spot the difference. There has been a remarkable growth of capacity in our training programs, so that the majority, 8 out of 9 gardens are now headed by black horticulturists. Most important, that is of course important to all garden directors, is financial sustainability. In 1881, McCown, who was then director of that old Cape Company garden in Cape Town, commented that South African botany has to carry on a perpetual fight against insolvency. And I think many garden directors around the world sort of have this feel that they are fighting insolvency. However, we were able to turn that around. And, we've missed something in this slide, but let's not worry. What I'm going to show you, it's interesting. What I can tell you that's not on the slide is that the financial profile of Kirstenbosch, which has 766,000 visitors a year. That's been the sort of, it's plateaued out at about 750 to 780,000 visitors a year. The income from these is about 3.5 million, and the cost of running the garden is 3.3 million. So when income exceeds expenditure, directors are happy. So Kirstenbosch has been happy for the last 10 years. What is interesting, though, is that the gate income is 45% of that total. The rentals of restaurants, tea rooms, venues is 20%. But the biggest surprise for us over the last 20 years has been the growth, and now it's been the steady flow of funding from concerts. 35% of the operational costs of Kirstenbosch comes from concerts. So just a few snaps of a few of the items that make Kirstenbosch financially sustainable. Firstly, is to have a pretty face. You've got to have a pretty scene to attract tourists. Concerts attract 8 to 10,000 concert goers for family picnic concerts every Sunday evening through summer. And of course, tourists that enjoy the flowers for their spectacle. The chance of having an iconic plant, and I was delighted to see a specimen of this Strelitzia reginae Mandela's gold in your orchid house, in the orchid display. If you haven't seen it, go and take note of it. It's very special, and it's very special for a good reason. In 1996 or 5, I got a note from the South African ambassador in Rome to say that an Italian newspaper was running a competition to name a plant after Mandela. So it was quite an interesting and innovative initiative, but the problem was that they had chosen a weed, a South African plant that had become a weed in Mediterranean areas. So it was a weed across the Mediterranean basin in California and in Australia, oxalis. And oxalis, which would have been an insult to Mandela's name to have it associated with him. So I sent off a note hastily to Rome and said it would be a diplomatic incident if they continued with this. And fortunately, they withdrew, and the ambassador inquired, well, what are we going to name? So I said, no, we've got a good plant. But of course, we hadn't. So I had to get the people like John Manning and others together to quickly rustle up a very interesting new discovery. And although John Manning found a very nice gladiolus, it wasn't particularly exciting. I mean, it might have been exciting to a taxonomist. It wasn't exciting to the public. And John Winter, our curator of Kirstenbosch at the time, said, no, he's got this lovely golden Strelitzia. So we pulled this out and presented it duly to President Mandela, and it's since been known as Mandela's Gold. And in fact, it's available all around the world now. So it's a good tribute to Mandela and also to Kirstenbosch. We also introduced sculptures from Zimbabwe, from local artists, and took on, for us, big challenges like building a big conservatory for our succulents and the smaller plants that collectors want to pick up and put into their pockets when they're walking through a garden. So you've always got this problem about sort of passionate collectors that will take away these tiny little stone plants and things like that. So we built this conservatory, we raised funds for it and many other projects. Of course, we wanted to have a full representation of South African succulents, being the sort of succulent center of the world, and bringing a baobab, a fully grown baobab, into down to Cape Town from the Zimbabwe border was quite a challenge. Putting a baobab on the back of the pickup truck is not easy, but we got it down there. It was rather awkward to fit it into the glass house, but it's up and alive, and it's the center point of that lovely collection. Research. Finally, research is always a key element of a botanical garden, a botanical institution, and Pearson, who I've quoted repeatedly, simply because he had such a perception of what is important for botanical gardens, noted that research is or should be undertaken with the single objective of discovering truth. So that's the sort of bottom line for science, I guess. But he added that, well, sometimes research can bring surprises, and those surprises can be of economic benefit. And I want to illustrate that. Well, firstly, despite his passion for research and that of Compton too, a research program didn't really develop in Kirstenbosch until we were able to establish a new research center and biodiversity center about 10 years ago with funds raised from friends and government. And one of the important issues that many ecological and horticultural issues that was researched was the importance of fire. Fire, like in California and Australia, is a key driver of the structure and function of the fynbos, the Cape flora. And here you see helicopters bombing the fires up in the hill slopes above Kirstenbosch. But what we didn't know, and what one of our researchers, Hannes de Lange, found, was that in understanding germination of seeds of these very difficult Cape plants, one needed smoke. There's an active compound in smoke, which he was able to capture through bubbling smoke through a water bath, and then placing just a piece of filter paper into the water, drying it out, and then using that as a seeding substrate. He found that you could get about a 90% germination rather than about a 3% germination. And in fact, now at Kirstenbosch, at the Kirstenbosch shop, you can get a Mandela's Gold starter pack, which has 5 seeds of Mandela's Gold plus a Kirstenbosch seed primer. So you just dip this in water and bingo, you've got Mandela's Gold growing, if you're lucky. But that was one of the serendipitous results of research, pure research on the horticology of threatened species. More sort of fundamental to ecosystem challenges into the future is climate change, and the Kirstenbosch research that has been undertaken on the distribution and population genetics and dynamics of that wonderful, iconic Allodichotoma, the quiver tree, has been that its distribution is shrinking. It's shrinking from the north as it gets hotter. It's not moving south as fast as one would expect because just the population dynamics are slow. And so we're seeing that the disappearance of the habitat of Allodichotoma. Even more important is the information that's coming out of our research laboratories on the impact of carbon dioxide enrichment, the rising concentration of carbon dioxide is having a significant impact on the dynamics of African savannas, the relationship between trees and shrubs, and this would probably be measured also in Australia and in South America in the tropical savannas, because the photosynthetic pathways of trees and shrubs being C3 and C4, the one being accelerated by enrichment from CO2 rise, the other not, means that when fires come through the savannas, the young trees are growing at a faster rate than the evolutionary sort of pace, because they're getting this little burst from CO2, and they're getting their growth points above the fire kill zone. And this might seem a very subtle and esoteric discovery, but what it means is that bush encroachment, the thickening of woody vegetation in savannas, which has very negative impacts on pastoralists and grazers, and the structure of the savanna is changing. So that has been a significant discovery by our researchers and of profound import to management of African savannas, whether it's for cattle or wildlife. Okay, finally, I'm just going to give you a quick buzz around the 9 gardens, or the 8 that you haven't seen. Pearson again noted that quite apart from mere geographical considerations, it is obvious that a single garden, such as Kirstenbosch, however large and well managed and well equipped, will not serve the whole of South Africa. So back in 1910, he anticipated the need not just for Kirstenbosch, but for gardens around the country in each each biogeographic region. A second bit of sense came from his mentor, Thistleton Dyer, who in 1880 wrote something which is also very important and something that gives a message to botanical garden directors around the world. And that is, the site for a botanical garden must be conveniently accessible A garden, however well managed and stocked with interesting plants, will be sure to languish if withdrawn in consequence of inconvenience of situation from the eye of the residents. Rather contorted English, but basically, you've got to put your garden where the people are. And so this has been a message that we've had to follow. And there you see the 9, and there's a 10th garden coming up in South Africa in different biogeographic zones, different climatic zones, and as close as possible to the people that we wish to have enjoy the gardens. We've got in the Karoo, in the desert, the Karoo Desert Garden with a wonderful array of succulents, a great science collection. We have to keep these under lock and key because many visitors from Japan, Germany, and Texas have a trend to picking up these and walking off with them. So you can have a look at them, but under supervision, especially if you speak with a particular accent. Down on the coast, at Betty's Bay, where we live, a wonderful mini Kirstenbosch dedicated just to the flora of this mountain range. This mountain range, very small, has 1,800 species of plants. It's about the size of Washington, D.C., the area that they've got all these species. In the Lowveld, next to the Kruger National Park, a tropical garden with 800 species of South African trees, also a wonderful collection of cycads and clivias, and a real pleasure to visit. The aloe garden in the Walter Sisulu Garden, just outside of Johannesburg. And in Pretoria, a garden that includes, as all our gardens do, this includes a garden of traditional use of the Ndebele people, which is the local people of that area. We have gardens for all the main ethnic groups or traditional groups in South Africa at the different gardens. And then finally, the latest of the gardens up on a plateau, the Huntham Plateau. It's called the Huntham National Botanical Garden in the little village just outside the village of Nieuwoudtville that calls itself the bulb capital of the world. And it certainly is. It's got the richest diversity of geophytes, of bulbs that you can find anywhere. Within the space of a few kilometers, you can see more species of flowering irises, orchids, amaryllises than you'll find in the whole of North America. And some of these, such as the bulb manila, have a brilliant show in spring. And here's just a mix kaleidoscope of some of the spring flowers. And then in autumn, you have this wonderful display of amaryllis, of Brunsvigia, that is just covers the rich dolerite soils of this site. We were fortunate with help. I was able to find a donor in California who was looking for a farm in Africa. You know, they all go and watch Out of Africa, the movie, and then they, like Karen Blixen, want to have a farm in Africa. And we were able to bring this wonderful Californian across. I took him up to the site with his wife on a blisteringly hot day in the middle of the dry season. There wasn't a flower on the landscape. So he'd come all the way from Santa Barbara or wherever it was, across the universe, and all I could show him was a dead, barren, stony, hostile, 40 degrees centigrade landscape. And I think he took pity on me, because I think what he had expected was a scene out of, the Serengeti. And here he had this rather hostile landscape. So he said, look, how much do you need, Brian? I said, well, I need, whatever it was, $500,000 or more. And he said, well, let me give you a check. So that was good. So we were able to buy that, and it's become a wonderful, wonderful garden. So to round off, just a few conclusions of the lessons we've learned from involvement with the botanical gardens development in South and Southern Africa, and just a few take-home thoughts. Firstly, one's got to set big and bold and long-term challenges, and we when we got together, when this new amalgamated institute was established, we decided we need to be a world leader in African botanical gardens, or botanical gardens developed in Africa. It was surprisingly how many of my colleagues thought, oh no, it's far too sort of ambitious, and we're not going to do it. But they've all been they've all associated with that. Secondly, to share that vision across all the stakeholders and partnerships. So we've been fortunate in partnering with many NGOs, government departments, universities, and many, many international colleagues, such as Missouri Botanical Garden. We've been fortunate through the leadership of Peter Raven and through Peter Wise-Jackson and Peter Crane at Kew, and the network of botanical gardens involved in conservation that Peter Wise-Jackson was instrumental in getting moving some years back, has been a wonderful network to work with. Thirdly, to fast-track the vision through strategic opportunism. Now, none of you have heard of this term, strategic opportunism, I'm sure, and certainly no masters in business administration will use the term. But it's fundamental for garden directors in developing countries. In first world countries, I think you've got a much stronger control on your budget and on the future. In Africa, you have no control of the present, let alone the future. And so you've got to be opportunistic. So the fundamental thing is to have a good strategy and then take advantage of any opportunity that comes along. And the story of Kirstenbosch is all the way along. It's just jumping in at the right opportunity. And that's what we call strategic opportunism. Identifying exciting and winning projects, well, you all know this. Any garden director knows that you've got to have a story that your friends and donors will find exciting. And we had many, such as that glasshouse project and the research center and the education programs and the buses. Good luck and good timing is something that nobody can determine, but it has certainly been a feature. And for South Africa and for developing countries more than elsewhere, one needs to align with government policy. One has to be socially relevant. Therefore, every component of a strategic plan must relate to government's intent. And that has been talk of opportunism. We were very fortunate that when we established this new institution, the Convention on Biological Diversity had just been signed, ratified. And so much of the program of the CBD was adopted by our government and could be adopted by our institution. So we could have this parallel between what we were doing and what the government wanted. And then, of course, the key thing is building lasting friendships with your donor community, your friends, your associates. And that was always an ingredient that you could not replace. So to end off, I just quote Rutherford about perhaps the most important thing and the most attractive thing about botany and gardening and horticulture is that nothing of great consequence was ever achieved without passion, and it's passion that has driven Kirstenbosch. Kirstenbosch, which I think is arguably the most beautiful garden in Africa. Thank you.